Okay, we're back and we're doing episode 5 today. We had a bit of a chat on mortgagee sales. And I guess from my perspective, we were talking about dairy last week, and Edwin, you were asking us various questions about dairy. And I've had a few viewers contact me directly and say, we didn't talk about A1 versus A2 milk.
Is that like B1 and B2?
It could be, yeah. Fortunately, they're not as fun and they cost a lot more. Now, the A1 versus A2 argument is the protein in milk. So that is the big part of the nutritional value of dairy. But I had a few people say, well, is A2 any better? Now, are you aware of the story behind the health benefits of A2, Edwin?
Mate, as I said, I went off milk a while ago, and I only drink milk as a default on a mocha because I'm tired of telling people how I drink my long black with a bit of honey. So that I confuse too many baristas get confused with that order. So my default is a mocha. So that's the only time I drink milk.
Well, the viewers wanted to ask me what is the health benefits of A2. There was a lot of talk probably, I don't know, 15 years ago when they first discovered the main difference between the caseins in milk. Well, not the first time they discovered, but they identified it as a difference. And there was a growing trend towards people talking about lactose intolerance. Then they started looking at other elements in the milk, the proteins, and what the problem was. And I guess the majority of anecdotal evidence that people come back with is that they feel sort of digestive discomfort or bloating after drinking milk, which is exactly what you discussed. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I thought it might be interesting to talk to you about it as well, because this was the very thing that we sort of started the conversation with. So if you talk about A1 and A2, I'll bring up a little graphic here that actually gives you a good example of what they are. So that is what you call a beta-casein. Now, the beta-casein, there's 80% of the protein in milk is a beta-casein, and it's either going to be A1 or A2. And there are 207 amino acids in that chain that are identical. A1 and A2 are identical, except for that circle there you can see, which is in the 67th position. And the difference between A1 and A2 are two little amino acids called histidine and proline, or histidine and proline, depending whether you're a tomato or a tomato. So if you're talking about A1 protein, the majority of that comes from Holstein Friesians, Ayrshire cows. A2s come from Jersey cows.
These are breeds of cows,
yeah, Limousin cows, those sort of things. So there is a difference in the type of milk the cows produce. In Australia, there is a company called the A2 Milk Company, and whilst they don't have a patent on the protein, what they do have a patent on is the genetics of the cattle that produce that milk. So that's how they can control their IP, is they actually control the bloodlines of the cattle that produce the milk, primarily Jersey and Limousin cattle. There's also the Indian cattle as well. It looks like big Brahman sort of things there. They produce A2, but they produce in a lot less volume. So with dairy, the balance is volume versus feed. How much milk do you get out versus how much feed do you put in?
And does the actual feed itself, Lee, does the actual feed itself play any role whatsoever in this, or is it the genetics of the cow that's a predominant factor?
Yeah, the predominantly genetics will determine how much of each type of protein. So there are some cattle like the Jersey, they produce predominantly A2. There's a tiny amount of A1 in there, but it's mainly A2. But if you don't give them good nutrition, then your protein falls away pretty quickly and you don't have good amino acid development within the milk anyway. So you've got those sort of issues going on there. Now, the A2 proline is meant to be easier on the gut. The histidine is the issue that people have. And I thought, okay, well, histidine, as the name probably suggests, is related to histamines. So when you're talking about an allergic reaction, that swelling, itchy you get if you get a bite or something, that's histamines in your system. You need histidine to produce histamine. But it's not just the only function. Now, I'll just bring that graphic back up again for a second. So your histidine and histamine response, I'll get onto that in a minute. But what I wanted to talk about here is basically where those two molecules or those two amino acids are at the 64th position. It allows for a thing called a cleaving site, which is a very clever way of saying this is how we break down the molecule when we are digesting it. And what we get is a beta-casein protein. That's a very flash word for another type of protein.
Don't worry,
I'm
lost now.
So I'm not going to get too far into it, but I just thought I'd throw the names out there for people. And I will put a lot of links into the description I've got a whole mess of studies that I looked at there, so I will put those into the description. But what you can see there is the studies relating to the A1 protein, or specifically that BCM7, that's the beta-casein 7. And it's a very clever thing called an opioid peptide. Now, opioid meaning it follows that part of your brain, the opioid pathway of your brain. But I guess the issue here is, what do those studies show you? And what I found after looking at 30-odd studies in the past few days is that the main issue people have is if you have a sensitivity to it, obviously. So if you have an allergic reaction, or you have some sort of gut issue that doesn't allow it, maybe your biome's a bit thrown out, maybe genetically you can't produce it. There are a series of enzymes, a protease enzyme that breaks it down. So you need to have that in your system, and if you don't produce it in your system, you can't get to it. And then, of course, the other issue is that these studies is they showed that possibly it's more prevalent in infants than it is in children over 4, and definitely once you hit 12, you don't seem to have the same residence of that BCM7 in your system. So to summarize that, what that means is when you digest A1, you get this BCM7. And the question is, what does that BCM7 do to your system? So that's the question there. Now, there's a whole lot of studies that I've got that I'll link there, but the main ones are people claim that it causes type 1 diabetes. Now, I can tell you there is no evidence for that. A couple of suggestions to say maybe you've got to be careful if you're sensitive. And they were what we call observational studies. Now, Jen and I both know observational studies are great, but they are literally people looking at a group of a cohort of potential, whether it be people or subjects, whatever the case is, but you have no influence on the actual assessment. You don't actually, you're only able to control the factors. So
it's not a very good quality study.
Yeah, it's a good indicator.
It's interesting, study. But I mean, it's sort of like looking at your new listings or something. It's an indicator. It gives you a bit of a feel, but it's not.
Well, I tell you what I feel when I have milk is I feel like I need to go for a walk and get away from people. They can look at me when I let them rip.
Well, there is that the protease does produce. Well, in fact, there's a very clever thing. It's called decarboxylase. Now, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that.
Well, next time somebody says, "Oh, you dropped one," I say, "No, I just decarboxylated."
That's exactly right. What it does is it knocks the carbon off the end of the ring and produces CO2. So that's exactly what it does. Decarboxylase is really important. Like, for instance, the histidine amino acid is what we call a conditional essential amino acid. You've got 9 amino acids in your body that you need to eat. You can't produce them internally. There's about 23 to 26, I think, I can't remember the exact number, that you need to produce proteins in your body. 9 of them we can't make. We have to consume them. That's why we eat meats and plant protein and things like that. That's where we get them from. Histidine, you find it not only in milk, but in meat, in nuts, in soy, all the places you get protein from the world. So it's a pretty common protein. So the issue there is that you need to produce that in your body, and usually you produce it through what we call vitamin D decarboxylase. So basically it's the process where they take vitamin D, they break a bit off, stick another bit on through enzymes, and off it goes to be histidine. And what does histidine do? Well, it's really important for your kidneys, super important for protecting your nerve cells, really important for what we call intracellular signaling. So when your gut needs to tell your brain something, it uses that nervous pathway. So people talk about histidine and think, oh, it's terrible, it's histamines, it causes inflammation and reactions, but it's actually really important for a whole lot of other places in your body. So that's really important. But I just wanted to quickly cover the couple of the conditions. So we mentioned type 1 diabetes, which, no, not going to happen. There are too many other factors at play. The second one that they talk about a lot, sorry, I lost my notes here, is things like heart conditions, heart health. Now, the studies that I'll throw up there, the 2 or 3 studies that I've got, basically say there is no difference between people that take type A1 versus A2. Their blood vessels, their blood pressure, their inflammation response, all the same. So that one is a complete furphy. You're not going to get any heart condition from taking eating A1 versus A2 protein. Third one they talk about a lot of is things like SIDS. Now, the SIDS one was really interesting because when you have a look at the studies,
so that's sudden infant death syndrome.
When you look at things like that, what they've found is when you consume that A1 protein and your BCM7 levels in your blood, they're looking at how much of this beta-casein protein is in your blood, or peptide, I should say, is in your blood. With children below 2, they find that the residence time is a lot longer. And what they found is kids who suffer from sleep apnea. Now, sleep apnea, I suffer sleep apnea. That's where you stop breathing in the night. So, you know, you might stop for 10 seconds, you might stop for 2 minutes. So those of us lucky to have some sort of sleep apnea have to hook ourselves up with pumps and you know, masks and hoses and all sorts of things. You kind of feel a bit sort of sci-fi when you go into bed, hooked up to all these machines. But little kids that suffer it, which is a precondition for SIDS occurring, they found that the BCM7 was a longer residence time in their blood. So that is something that is tangible, that is scientifically provable. Now, this also comes back to the argument of, do you feed a child bovine milk or is breastfeeding better? Now, I'm not going to get involved to that argument.
I will.
Yeah, we have our beliefs, and our kids, Jen was very good to make sure that she breastfed both of our kids for an appropriate amount of time. But if they had to start up on bovine milk, they could have had that BCM7 in their system, and that could lead to issues. Now, I'm not saying it will. I'm not saying it's a guarantee. These are indicative assessments. These are observational assessments. They're looking at what's happened and can they make a link between X and Y.
But usually in children under 2, if not breastfed, then they're on a formula of some description and not straight up cow's milk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but if it's based on both, a lot of this stuff's based on goat's milk. Actually, a lot of goat's milk goes into infant formulas, particularly sensitive infant formulas. So that's a big one there. The third one I wanted to talk about, which people love throwing around because it is such a broad spectrum, and I use that term spectrum intentionally, is the autism spectrum. Now, autism is so complicated. If you consider the factors that go into how to diagnose autism, now my nephews up in Brisbane, all 3 of them have been diagnosed on the spectrum at one point or another, but they're very high functioning. There's not a great deal of problem there, but it does have a bit of a problem. What they found, I've got a bit of a cheat sheet here because there is a lot of information on autism. The theory, the theory is that the BCM7 peptide can play a role in developing autism, but when you actually go to apply that in the real world, the mechanism doesn't hold up. So this is an example where the theory, where we think, yes, that works. We sit down on a piece of paper and go, that should happen. We go into the real world and put it into the Witstar rats, which are those white albino rats you see in laboratories all the time, and they don't bear out those results. There's another study.
So that's in vitro, say, versus in vivo. Okay, so in vitro from the Latin of glass, or in a petri dish or in a test tube or something like that, or even looking at it from chemical formulas and that sort of thing. They said, oh, it might do. Let's test it. Let's look at rats. Didn't work out. Yeah,
and those Witstar rats, those white rats with the red eyes you see in the labs, they're designed specifically to have as close to human attributes as possible. The same way at the moment they're testing all the COVID stuff on ferrets, because ferret lungs are very similar in function to human lungs.
Have a lot of ACE2 receptors similar to in that humans have. So there's a big thing with the ACE2 receptors and the efficacy of, or how adapted COVID is to attacking ACE2 receptors. Not only do they appear in our lungs, but they're in our
heart, gut,
brain, liver, kidneys. And this is where people are having secondary kidney failure, on dialysis. They're in our blood vessels, everywhere, right? And so that's why they're using ferrets, because they have a high number of ACE2. They have a similar level. Okay.
Yeah, so you've got these rats that are very similar with their immunological response, particularly is the one that we're talking about there. So there's a study there that I'll put in the link. It's a fantastic study. It looked at kids who have consumed cow's milk versus breastfeeding, and they looked at the BCM serum levels, the amount of BCM7 in their blood. And what they found is some levels dropped really quick, others stayed elevated. So there's no correlation between being breastfed cow's milk, whether you drop your levels quickly or they stay up. It really is down to your individual physiology. And I guess this is where I'm sort of driving this discussion is it's individual physiology that's going to become the predominant feature. You've got to know your own bones before you can sort of make any big claims. Now, within that, there's also 2 other studies. One showed there was a link to developmental issues. One showed there was no link to developmental issues. So this is the fun bit we have as scientists, is to look at those studies and go, is this legit? Is this work? Does this science make sense? Is it peer reviewed? Has someone looked at it? Is it double blind? Is it, all these things?
How many in the studies? Like if it's not done in humans, then in how many rats? How many times? Was it tested again? Yeah. And all of those sorts of things. So,
but I can tell you, for as far as the autism one, as far as the type 1 diabetes studies, there has not been one single specifically designed human trial that is double-blind efficacy to make sure that we can actually prove the results. They've all been observational or meta-studies or people looking at other people's data. So no one's actually done the hard yard science to prove it. And this drives me mad, because this is what we talk about. We've been talking about this with hydroxychloroquine, and we'll call it the cerveza sickness for the sake of YouTube, and those sort of things. And what we've found is that there's so many vested interests in this. You'd be better off selling 1,000 placebos than one cure. So this is where we sort of think about what's going on in the pharma world, what's going on in the food world. How is it that we're not getting this science coming through, or when we do get science coming through, even people like Jen and I, who are we're not high-flying scientists by any stretch, but we've got a good understanding.
Read a scientific paper and scrutinise it to a fairly good degree and assess whether it's useful or not.
But we can call BS on this science because we know what sounds true and what doesn't ring true, and you can pick holes in these things like, you're picking holes in cheese. So, I mean, it's really a big issue there. So they're sort of the conditions that I just wanted to refer to there. But I guess the one that was most relevant to yourself, Edmund, was the digestive issues one. So I had a look at some of those studies there. Now, the majority of digestive issues with milk is obviously focused on lactose, but then there is the adverse reaction to the protein as well. So we've got anecdotal reports of less bloating after drinking A2 milk, but we've got no hard evidence thus far. It's just people going, oh, I reckon that's the case. So unfortunately, anecdotal evidence, good idea to sort of go, oh, well, look in that direction. But when you get there, you may not find that's the result. It's just, as it says, anecdotal. Now, there was one study of 41 people, and I can conclusively say that consuming A1 protein caused those people to have a softer stool. So if you want to have an easier time in the bathroom, maybe A1's not a bad thing. So that's what I mean. You're going to find out about digestive health, and that's the result you get, is you get soft shit. But there was also a second Chinese study that looked at a bigger cohort of A2, and they found that people that consumed A2 had less digestive bloating after consuming A2 milk. But I like to balance that with, there's not a great dairy culture in the Chinese culture, and I mean, you'd be able to speak to that as well. It's a more modern phenomenon to have a higher dairy content in the Chinese diet. Therefore, if you're looking at biomes, they're not going to have the lactobacillus to the same level that, say, a Westerner will, who have been brought up on milk all their life. So that's not an unexpected thing. And I guess the third study there was some A1 histamine proteins in those people that are sensitive to that did have a bit of inflammation. So if you have a sensitivity, if you note that every time you have milk and then you try A2 milk and you don't, you might be the very person that actually this study is looking at and actually saying, yep, you have an issue with that A1 protein or the histidine amino acid in the A1 protein, and you would be better off consuming that A2. But my personal opinion, A2 milk is not a panacea of health. You're not going to feel better all the time from drinking it. It is a good milk. It is more expensive because of the story behind it. It is expensive because of the patent on the bloodlines. But ultimately, if you don't have a problem with it, you're not going to get any benefit out of having that A2 milk.
There you go. So it's a very, very small thing.
And well, I'm going
to do my own test now. Next time I go, I'm going to have A1, and then I'm going to have A2, and we'll see.
Maybe not a long drive in the car.
Yeah, do it at home. Don't do it before a drive. But I was going to say, Australian scientists have a very good history of self-experimentation. Yeah. We're willing to have a go and put ourselves on the line. So join that really long distinguished list of Australian scientists of self-experimentation and see what happens, and you can report back to us.
But also in saying that, the lactose is more often than not
80 to 85% of people
is the issue,
who have an issue,
which is a sugar.
Yeah.
And when you consume other than liquid milk, so yogurt, which is fermented, cheese, which is fermented, which means that the microbes in the fermenting microbes, lactobacillus and the like, have already done that work, have already broken that down for you. And that's why you can eat plenty of cheese, but not a milkshake. So there you go.
Yeah. So this will be the last conversation about milk for all those viewers who are bored of milk or don't want to talk about milk. But I had a couple of people ask me about it, so I thought I would dive into it because it's something that I'm interested in. I like the idea of what the proteins do. We are made of protein and amino acids, so it's really important to see how they affect our bodies.
Well, next time I'm going to get you to do a report. We'll have a chat. I want to know how the bloody holes are made in the cheese.
Oh, that's easy. That's exactly the problem you were having when you're drinking milk, mate.
Oh, okay. Yeah, excellent. I didn't know whether you were going to go there, but you did.
I'll always go there.
We're a nation of self-experimenters, and we love self-experimenting, right? But I don't recommend people self-experiment and buy off the plan. Whatever you do, don't buy off the plan. Self-experiment. It's going to be too costly.
Done to death.
Self-experimentation of science is great. Self-experimentation of investing in property probably isn't the best idea.
No, not at all. That's been fun. I'll think of a topic for next time, Lee. And I'll a group of that we can that creates a little bit of controversy. I think I'll think of one. And we'll have a chat about it over the weekend.
Oh, mate, if you want to start an argument, ask me about gluten.
I reckon hot button topics are kombucha.
Yeah, we can do kombucha.
Gluten.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyone can shoot us a message if you've got a pick.
Do we wear masks or don't we wear masks?
That one's an easy one. I can give you a lot of descriptions about that.
Well, we finally had some people. We had Dr. Karen Phelps saying, "I think we really should be wearing masks in certain circumstances." It's like, yeah.
If we can only go back to what we were saying early January, huh?
Yeah.
Jesus, sorry, I just got my head in.
We could stay on like we could talk for another hour and a half, but no, I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Lee, for all that.
Thank you very much. We'll leave it there for tonight. But if you've got any questions or any comments, please hit us up in the comments. You can get us on Twitter. You can get us through our websites, your Ribbon Property and CE Life Sciences. You've seen the Twitter come up. All the links will be in the description. All the links to those studies I referred to will be in the description, as well as some of those listings that we talked about in the mortgagee section. But apart from that, I really appreciate everyone viewing all the way to the end. And if you do like what you hear, please give us a like and a subscribe. But apart from that, we'll see you all next week.
Cheers, Edwin.
Cheers, have fun.
You too.